Ruth Holloway had buried a husband, a son, and every soft thing inside her all before she turned 34. She had learned to sleep light, trust no one, and keep her rifle within arm's reach. So when hoofbeats broke the silence of that July dusk, hard, uneven, desperate, she did not hesitate. She stepped off the porch with the barrel already raised. She just didn't expect the voice that stopped her. Small, cracked, barely a whisper above the heat. "Papa, I'm so thirsty." If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and follow Ruth's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The drought had been going on for 41 days. Ruth knew the exact number because she had marked each one in the back of her ledger, right beside the column where she tracked how much water was left in the spring. 41 mornings she had walked out to check the level, before she did anything else, before coffee, before feeding the chickens, before she allowed herself to think about the day ahead. 41 mornings she had pressed her palm flat against the wet rock at the base of the spring and whispered a word that wasn't quite prayer and wasn't quite a curse, but lived somewhere in between. The spring was still flowing. That was the only good thing Ruth Holloway had left, and she intended to keep it. The land around her homestead had gone the color of old bone. The creek half a mile east had gone to mud in June and stopped altogether by the third week of July. The Danner brothers, who ranched the wide flat to the north, had lost 40 head to heat and thirst before they started pushing their remaining cattle south along the fence line. Her fence line, looking for water they hadn't paid for and didn't ask permission to use. Ruth had told them no. Twice. Politely the first time. The second time she had brought the rifle along to underline the point. They had not come back, but she knew others would. A live spring in the middle of this kind of summer was not just valuable, it was survival. And survival made men do things that had nothing to do with law or decency. Ruth knew that better than most. She had watched her husband Daniel survive 2 hard winters, a bad fever season, and a bank threatening foreclosure, only to drop dead of a stroke in the south field on an ordinary April morning with the grass just starting to come green. She had watched her infant son Tommy fight his way into the world and then slip quietly back out of it before he had drawn 10 days of air. She had kept this land and this spring through every one of those seasons, not because she was tough, though she was, but because she had nowhere else to go and no one left to lean on. That had made the decision simple. Not easy. Simple. You worked. You protected what was yours. You did not open your door to strangers in drought season, because strangers in drought season only came for one thing. She was thinking about exactly that when she heard the hoofbeats. It was late in the evening, the sun sitting low and brutal just above the ridgeline, turning everything it touched the color of a banked fire. Ruth was on the porch mending a harness strap when the sound came: 2 horses moving fast, then slowing, then one of them going uneven in the gait. A stumble, not a throw-off, a lame foot or close to it. She set down the harness and had the rifle off the wall hook before the first rider cleared the cottonwood line. 2 horses. 1 man. 1 child on the saddle in front of him, slumped sideways, head lolling against the man's forearm. He was holding her upright with one arm and managing both horses with the other, and he was doing a poor job of both because the lame horse kept pulling left and the child kept sliding. Ruth stepped off the porch and leveled the rifle at his chest. "That spring," she called across the yard, "is private property." The man pulled both horses to a stop. He was big, broad through the shoulders, trail dusty, his hat dark with sweat at the brim. He looked at the rifle without flinching, which told her something right away. Either he was brave or he was too exhausted to be afraid, and at this point she wasn't sure there was much difference. "I can see that, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, not from aggression, but from thirst. She could hear it even at that distance, the dry rasp of a man who had been in the sun too long. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm asking." "Asking isn't the same as getting," Ruth said. "Who are you?" "Elias Turner. I own the Double T spread up near Calhoun Ridge." He shifted slightly in the saddle, and the motion made the child stir. "This is my daughter Maisie. She's 8 years old, and she has been riding in this heat since morning. I would not be standing on your land asking anything of you if she was not—" He stopped, pressed his mouth flat. "If she was not in a bad way, ma'am." Ruth's eyes went to the child. Even from 20 feet she could see the girl's lips were cracked and pale. Her small hands were limp against the saddle horn. Her face was the dull waxy color that came before something worse. Ruth did not lower the rifle. "What are you doing out this far with an 8-year-old in July heat?" she said. "That's a fair question, and I'll answer it fully once my daughter has had water." His voice didn't rise. It stayed level in a way that was either impressive or infuriating. Ruth hadn't decided which yet. "Please." The last word cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw that the word did not come easily to him, that he was a man who was accustomed to having things without needing to ask. The fact that he said it anyway told her something too. She stood there for 3 full seconds with the hammer cocked. Then the child lifted her head. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, the way eyes get when the body has started making internal negotiations with itself. Her lips moved, and the sound that came out was barely above the heat shimmer. "Papa, I'm so thirsty." Ruth uncocked the rifle. "Bring her over here," she said. "Just her." She met him at the edge of the porch with a tin cup of cool water from the morning pull still in the bucket she kept in the shade. Elias Turner dismounted with the child already in his arms, moving like a man who had been carrying her for hours, which he probably had. He walked straight to Ruth and held Maisie out, not as an offering, not as a manipulation, but the way a man holds something out when his arms are giving out and there is nowhere else to go. Ruth took the girl. Maisie was heavier than she looked. Heat-dense and slack, though not entirely unconscious, her fingers curled weakly around the front of Ruth's shirt, a reflex grip that had nothing behind it except the oldest kind of animal instinct. Ruth sat down on the porch step with Maisie across her lap and pressed the rim of the cup to those cracked lips. "Small sips," she said quietly. "Not fast. Your body won't keep it if you drink fast." Maisie drank. Slow at first, then faster. Ruth pulled the cup back twice before she let the girl have the rest of it. Elias Turner stood 3 feet away and watched every second of it without speaking. "She needs to get out of the sun and onto something cool," Ruth said. "The barn's in shade this time of evening, stone floor. She can lie on my bedroll." "I'll pay you for—" "I didn't ask for payment," Ruth said, standing with the girl and not looking at him. "You can water both horses at the trough, 1 bucket each. Don't let them gorge themselves." She carried Maisie into the barn before he could answer. Maisie Turner was stubborn, it turned out, even when she was half unconscious. By the time Ruth had her settled on the bedroll with a wet cloth across her forehead and the top 2 buttons of her collar undone, the girl was fighting her way back to awareness with the grinding determination of someone who did not care for being fussed over. Her eyes opened, fixed on Ruth, with a narrow evaluating look, and the first thing she said was, "Are you the lady who pointed the gun at my papa?" "I am," Ruth said. Maisie appeared to consider this with some respect. "He didn't shoot back." "No, he didn't. He usually doesn't back down from things." She said it matter-of-factly, the way children state facts they've absorbed from long observation. "You must have been real serious." "I was," Ruth said. "You should rest now." "I'm not tired." "You're exhausted. There's a difference." Maisie looked at her again with that same flat, assessing stare. Ruth had a feeling the girl used it on everyone, measuring them, filing the results somewhere behind those dark eyes for later use. "What's your name?" Maisie asked. "Ruth Holloway." "Is there a Mr. Holloway?" "Not anymore." Maisie was quiet for a beat. "My mama's not around anymore either," she said with a plainness that was somehow more devastating than grief would have been. "Papa doesn't like to talk about it." "Drink some more water," Ruth said, and handed her the refilled cup. Elias Turner was at the trough with the horses when Ruth came back out. He had taken off his hat and his coat, which told her he wasn't posturing anymore, or at least he had run out of energy for it. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the dry ground. "She's awake," Ruth said. "Talking, which I take as a good sign, though she's going to have a headache by tonight." Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of relief. Just a fraction of a degree, like a door opening the smallest crack. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet." Ruth stopped a few feet from him and crossed her arms. "I want to understand what you're doing 40 miles from your ranch in July with an 8-year-old and 2 horses and no wagon." He met her eyes. "We had a wagon. Axle broke about 12 miles east of here. Lost the feed I was hauling. One horse went lame, which you can see. I was trying to cut south across the flats to reach the road, and we got turned around in the dry creek bed." "Turned around," she repeated. "Lost," he said flat. "We got lost. I had a map, but the creek beds don't match what's on it anymore. The droughts moved everything." That at least was true. The landscape out here had been rearranging itself for weeks under the pressure of heat and dry wind. Old landmarks gone new gullies, opened up familiar draws, become unrecognizable. She had gotten disoriented herself once, and she had lived here for 11 years. "You should have had more water on you," she said. Yes. No argument. No excuse. Just the word. She studied him. He was not what she had expected, which, if she was honest, had been some version of the Danner brothers. Loud entitled, the kind of man who thought owning land made him the center of the universe. Elias Turner was not that. He was contained, careful, and he was looking at her the way people look at someone they have decided to take seriously against their initial expectation. She didn't know whether to find that reassuring or irritating. "You can stay in the barn tonight," she said. "Both of you. There's a pump inside. The girl can use the bedroll. You're on your own for sleeping arrangements." "I appreciate—" "I want you gone by first light," she said. "I'll loan you a canteen and some hardtack for the ride. Your horse needs a night's rest before she can carry weight again, so you'll have to lead her, not ride her. Understood?" He looked at her steadily. "Understood. And Mr. Turner?" She held his gaze. "I'm telling you this because you'll hear it from someone anyway. Every man in a 10-mile radius knows about this spring. 3 different outfits have already tried to push onto this land since June. I have made my position on that very clear. I don't care what your spread is worth or whose name is on your deed up in Calhoun Ridge. This land is mine. That spring is mine. And I shoot at coyotes regardless of what suit they're wearing." He did not blink. "I wasn't here for your spring, Mrs. Holloway." "No," she said. "You were just dying of thirst near it. There's a difference." She walked back to the house before he could answer. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the heat, which was partly true. July nights in this part of the country never really cooled, they just stopped being as hot as the days, which was a different thing entirely. She lay on top of her blanket in the close dark of the bedroom and listened to the cicadas scream in the mesquite out back, and thought about water levels and fence lines and the 2 strangers sleeping 40 yards away in her barn. She was not afraid of them. That was not what kept her awake. She was thinking about the girl's hands, the way Maisie's fingers had curled into Ruth's shirt without thinking, the pure reflex of it, the trust that goes bone deep in children before they have learned that trust is something to ration. Ruth had felt it like a stone dropped into still water, not painful exactly, but heavy, and sending out rings in all directions that she couldn't stop. She had not held a child since Tommy. She pressed her hand flat against the mattress beside her and kept her breathing even. "They'll be gone by morning," she thought. "First light. That's what I said." Outside, the cicadas went on screaming. The night pressed down like a wool blanket. Far to the north, heat lightning flickered along the top of the ridge, silent, sourceless, the kind of light that promises nothing. She was up before dawn anyway. She always was. She had the coffee on and the small bundle of hardtack wrapped when she heard the barn door and then Elias Turner's boot steps crossing the yard. He was already dressed. He had probably slept in his clothes, which she had done herself more times than she could count in the years since Daniel died. He knocked on the doorframe, even though the door was standing open, which she noted. "Miss Maisie still sleeping?" Ruth asked without turning from the stove. "She was when I left." A pause. "She usually wakes with the light. It's early yet." "Coffee's on the stove." Another pause, longer this time. She could feel him working out whether this was an invitation or just a statement of fact. She let him work it out. "Thank you," he said, and came in. He poured his own cup, which she also noted he didn't stand there waiting to be served. He moved around her kitchen with the careful economy of a large man who has spent time learning not to take up more space than necessary, and he sat down at the far end of the table without being asked. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. The sky outside was turning from black to a deep indigo blue, and the first birds were beginning their morning argument in the cottonwoods. Then he said quietly, "You said your husband isn't around anymore." "That's right." "How long have you been running this place alone?" 4 years. She set her cup down. "Going on 5. In a drought year." "In all the years," she said. "Drought's just what this one brought." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly. "You're managing the spring, the stock, the fence line, the—" "Mr. Turner." Her voice was even. "I didn't ask for your assessment of my situation." "No," he said. "I know you didn't." He looked up from his cup. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Holloway. I'm offering— I don't know what I'm offering. I suppose I'm asking how." She looked at him for the first time since he'd come inside. He was watching her with a directness that would have been rude from most people, but from him felt like the opposite, like respect, the kind that doesn't look away. "One day at a time," she said. "Same as anyone." "I have a daughter who has no mother," he said, and the bluntness of it hung in the air between them. "And I have a ranch that runs well on paper and feels hollow in every room. I am—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I am very good at providing for people. I am a great deal less good at the other parts." Ruth said nothing. "I don't know why I told you that," he said. "Probably because you haven't told anyone else," she said. He looked at her again, said nothing. The sky outside had gone pale gold along the bottom edge of the ridge. In the barn, something moved, a small sound, a child's voice asking something to no one in particular. Maisie was awake. Ruth stood up and poured a second cup of coffee, setting it on the counter beside the small covered plate she'd put aside biscuit from last night, a scrape of preserves she'd been rationing for weeks. She didn't think about it while she did it. She just did it. "She can eat before you go," Ruth said. Elias Turner looked at the plate, and then he looked at Ruth, and she turned away from whatever was in his face before she had to decide what to do with it. Maisie ate the biscuit in 4 bites, and then looked around the kitchen with the frank, systematic attention of a child cataloging everything she saw. "You live here by yourself?" she asked. "I do." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "Maisie," Elias said. "It's a fair question," Ruth said. She looked at the girl. "Sometimes." "Papa gets lonely," Maisie said with the serene confidence of someone reporting weather. "He just doesn't say it. He goes real quiet when he's lonely. And then he works more." Elias set his cup down on the table with a sound that was not quite a bang. "I'm right here, Maisie," he said. "I know," she said pleasantly. Ruth felt something shift in her chest, a reluctant pull of something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that sat between amusement and ache. She stood up and brought the hardtack bundle to the table. "This will last you until you reach the road," she said. "There's a trading post at the junction about 8 miles south. You can get what you need there." She looked at Elias. "How's your horse this morning?" "Better." He stood. She'll make 8 miles easy. I can manage from the junction." He picked up the bundle, then paused. His jaw moved slightly like a man deciding whether to say a thing he has decided several times not to say. "Mrs. Holloway." He set the bundle back down. "I want to make you an offer. A business one. Not charity, not anything else." He held her gaze. "That spring of yours is the only live water source in this part of the county right now. You know that. The other operators know it. And some of them are not going to stop at asking." Ruth's chin went up a degree. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Mr. Turner." "I don't doubt it," he said. "But you're one woman alone on 40 acres, and in a bad enough season, that's a target, not just a property. What I'm offering is legal documentation. I know the county recorder. I know the water rights lawyer in town. I can make sure your claim is on paper in a way that no one can argue in front of a judge." "And what do you want in return for that?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at him flatly. "All right," he said. I would like the right to bring water wagons from your spring to my herd, twice a month. I'll pay you fair market above it, and I'll make sure no one else pushes on your fence line while we have that arrangement in place." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "That's not nothing," she said. "No." A pause. "But it's fair." She crossed her arms. "I'll think about it." Maisie, who had been listening to all of this with her chin in her hands and an expression of deep professional interest, said, "Does that mean we might come back?" "It means I'll think about it," Ruth said, looking at the girl. "Which is more than I give most people." Maisie smiled. It was sudden and unguarded and lit up her whole face, and Ruth looked away from it quickly because it did something to her sternum that she wasn't prepared for. "Time to go," Elias said quietly. They were at the barn door, Maisie already up on the healthy horse when Ruth heard the sound. Far to the north, a thick rolling percussion, not thunder. She knew that sound. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Moving fast. She shaded her eyes and looked north across the flat. Dust cloud. Coming hard. "Mr. Turner," she said, and the way she said it made him turn immediately. She had already gone back to the porch for the rifle. He looked north at the dust. His face went still. "Do you know who that is?" she asked. He was quiet for 2 seconds. "Yeah," he said. "I think I might." The dust kept coming red-brown and thick against the pale summer sky, kicking up high enough that she could count the silhouettes underneath it. 4 riders, moving like men who had something to settle. Ruth checked the load in the rifle. "Mr. Turner," she said, low and even. "Whatever trouble you brought onto my land, you'd better start explaining it." He didn't look at her. He was watching the riders. "It's not trouble I brought," he said. "It's trouble that followed." And beside him, Maisie Turner went very still in the saddle, and her small face lost all its brightness at once, as if someone had reached up and pinched out a candle. Ruth saw it. And something in the way the child's expression changed, not surprised, not confused, but braced, told her that whatever was coming across that flat was not new. It had been coming for a long time. The 4 riders pulled up hard at the edge of Ruth's property line, their horses blowing foam and dust, and the man at the front of the group had the kind of face that had long since stopped bothering to hide what it was thinking. He was thick through the neck somewhere past 50, wearing a vest that had been expensive once and a badge that caught the early morning light in a way that was clearly intentional. His eyes went from Ruth to Elias, to the rifle in Ruth's hands, and then back to Elias with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who believed time was always on his side. "Elias Turner," he said, "you're a hard man to find." "I wasn't hiding Holt," Elias said. "I was traveling. With a busted wagon and a lame horse and no hands." Holt let the silence sit on that for a moment. "Funny kind of traveling." His gaze slid to Ruth. "And whose land is this?" "Mine," Ruth said. She did not lower the rifle. "Ruth Holloway, and you're sitting your horse on the wrong side of my fence line, so I'd suggest you state your business fast." Holt looked at her the way certain men look at women who speak plainly, with a thin, tolerant amusement that was meant to communicate that he was choosing not to be offended. "Ma'am, this is a county matter. I'd ask you to step back." "You'd ask me," Ruth said. "On my own land." "Ruth." Elias's voice was quiet, not commanding, just a warning with her name in it, which she hadn't given him permission to use, but she let it go because the situation required it. She kept the rifle up and her eyes on Holt. "Your business," she said again. Holt shifted in the saddle. "Mr. Turner here had a contractual obligation with the Caldwell Cattle Company regarding water access on his northern range. That contract has a penalty clause for abandonment of—" "I didn't abandon anything," Elias said. "My wagon broke down." "3 days ago," Holt said. "You've been 3 days without sending word." "Because I've been 40 miles from the nearest telegraph in July heat with a sick child." Elias's voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, something that had teeth. "If that reads like abandonment to Caldwell's lawyers, they're welcome to explain that to a judge." "They intend to," Holt said. "Which is why I'm here. They want you back at the ranch, Mr. Turner. Today. With or without your comfort." Maisie made a small sound from the saddle, not a word, just a breath that got clipped short. Ruth heard it. She didn't look at the girl, but she heard it. "He's not going anywhere," Ruth said, "until his horse is fit to travel." Every head turned toward her. "The animal went lame yesterday evening," she said. "She needs rest." "That's not a request, that's physiology. Anybody who knows horses knows you don't push a lame animal in this heat unless you want to kill it. So Mr. Turner will be on his way when his horse is ready. Not before." Holt stared at her. "Ma'am." "I also don't believe you have paper on him," Ruth said. "I think you have a message from a company that wants him nervous, and you're delivering it personally because someone's paying you to make it feel more serious than it is. So unless you've got a warrant in that vest pocket, I'd like you off my land." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. One of the riders behind Holt shifted his horse sideways. The second man kept his eyes on Elias. The third, younger, barely 20, was staring at Ruth with an expression she had no patience for, the particular look of a young man encountering a woman who wasn't afraid of him and not knowing what category to put that in. Holt said very quietly, "You're making an enemy, Mrs. Holloway." "I've got plenty already," Ruth said. "One more won't change my schedule." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Tomorrow morning, Turner. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He wheeled his horse without waiting for an answer, and his 3 men went with him back north into the dust they'd come from. Ruth held the rifle up until they cleared the cottonwood line. Then she lowered it slow and deliberate, and let out a breath through her nose. "Caldwell Cattle Company," she said without turning around. "Yes," Elias said. "They're the outfit that's been pressuring small ranchers on the North Water Table." "Yes." "And you have a contract with them." A pause. "I had a contract with them, past tense. I've been trying to terminate it legally for 4 months. That's what the feed run was about. I was meeting with a lawyer in Dunbar who's handling the dissolution." Ruth turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring. "So, you're not one of them?" "I am very much not one of them," he said quietly, "though I understand why you'd assume I was." She looked past him at Maisie, who was sitting rigid in the saddle, with her hands flat on the pommel, staring at the place where the riders had disappeared. The brightness the girl had worn all morning was completely gone now, and in its place was something Ruth recognized, that particular stillness children develop when they have learned that being visible during certain kinds of trouble makes things worse. "Maisie," Ruth said, "come down off that horse." The girl looked at her father. "Go on," Elias said. Maisie slid down, and Ruth caught her by the arm before her legs could buckle the heat, the leftover fever, the adrenaline all running out at once. The girl was shaking slightly, fine tremors that she was doing her best to suppress. "Inside," Ruth said. There's water in the kitchen, and you're going to drink 2 full cups before you do anything else." "I'm fine," Maisie said very fast. "You're shaking." "I'm cold." "It's 85 degrees and climbing," Ruth said. "Come inside." Maisie came inside. Elias Turner stood in the yard with his lame horse and the weight of the last 3 days on his shoulders, and said nothing for a full minute. Ruth came back out after she had settled Maisie at the kitchen table, and found him standing exactly where she'd left him. "Your horse needs water and shade," she said. "Put her in the east pen. There's a lean-to." "Mrs. Holloway." "Don't." She stopped on the porch step. "Don't apologize. I don't want an apology. What I want is an honest answer. Are those men going to come back?" He met her eyes. "Probably not today." "That's not the same as no." "No," he said. "It's not." She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she'd already decided. "Then you've got a problem, and I've got a problem. And the fact that we're standing on the same piece of ground right now means they're about to become the same problem. I'd rather know that clearly than pretend it isn't true." "That's—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider what he'd been about to say. "That's fair." "Good." She stepped off the porch. "East Penn, then come find me. We need to talk about that offer you made this morning, because what you didn't tell me when you made it was that accepting it puts a target on this land from the same people who are already following you, and that changes the terms considerably." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "It does." "I know," she said. "I still want to hear the rest of it." She walked past him toward the barn, and after a moment she heard him follow. By noon, the temperature had climbed to something that didn't have a comfortable number. Ruth had the kitchen window open, but there was no cross breeze, only the flat dead press of summer air and the distant metallic scream of cicadas in the mesquite. Maisie had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, with her head on her arms, which Ruth had covered with a damp cloth and chosen not to comment on. The girl's color was better. The waxy heat flush had faded to something closer to normal, but she was still running warm when Ruth checked her forehead. Not dangerously, just enough to matter. Elias sat across the table with a cup of water he'd been nursing for an hour, while they worked through the terms of his offer point by point with the careful, practical language of two people who had both been burned before and did not intend to sign anything they hadn't read twice. "The water access agreement," Ruth said. "Twice a month. I want 3 days' notice in writing before each wagon comes. Done. I want your lawyer, the one in Dunbar, to draft the water rights documentation himself, not a county clerk, a lawyer who will stand behind it. He will. And if Caldwell's people come back here, if they push on this fence line or threaten this property in any way while we have this arrangement, that's on you to handle. Not just legally. I mean personally." Elias set his cup down. "You think I'd leave you to deal with that alone?" It was not quite a question. "I think," Ruth said carefully, "that men with arrangements sometimes find it convenient to have poor memory about those arrangements when the cost goes up." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife's name was Caroline. She died 3 years ago. Fever, same as—" He stopped. "She was the kind of person who said exactly what she meant and expected the same in return. I have not always been good at the same in return, but I understood the value of it when I had it." He looked at Ruth steadily. "I won't leave you to deal with this alone. That's not an arrangement. That's just a fact." The kitchen was very quiet except for Maisie's soft sleeping breath and the cicadas outside. Ruth pulled the paper toward her. "Show me where your lawyer wants the property boundary described." The smell hit her first. Smoke. Not the lazy, familiar smell of a cook fire or a lantern wick. The sharp, spreading smell of something burning that wasn't meant to. Ruth was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move across the kitchen and out the back door in 3 steps, and she saw it immediately. A thin orange line moving along the dry grass beyond the north fence, maybe a quarter-mile out, feeding on the bone-dry mesquite and the dead creek grass that hadn't seen water in 6 weeks. Turner. She didn't look back. She was already moving toward the tool shed. Fire north fence line. Get up. She heard his boots hit the floor. The next 4 minutes were pure controlled motion. She had thought about this, had planned for it the way you plan for disasters in country that has been through them before. Wet burlap sacks from the water barrel by the shed door. The long-handled shovels. The hand pump on the rain barrel that was only half full, but better than nothing. She had both shovels out and 3 sacks soaking before Elias appeared behind her. He took one look at the fire line and did not ask any questions. He took the shovel from her hands, not as a statement of authority, but simply because she was already lifting the wet sacks with both hands, and something needed to carry what was left. "How far is the nearest break?" he said. "Dry creek bed, 70 yards west along the fence. If it reaches the creek bed, it'll jump and we'll lose the whole north field." "Then we go left," he said. They went left. What followed was not heroic. It was hot, ugly physical work, the kind that strips everything down to breath and muscle, and the immediate decision in front of you. Ruth beat sparks with the wet burlap until her arms ached. Elias dug a brake line with the shovel, throwing dry earth, moving faster than she had expected a man of his size to move, low and efficient, and she revised something about him silently while she worked. The fire tried twice to jump the brake. The second time it nearly made it, and Ruth hit the leading edge with the flat of her sack so hard she felt the impact through both shoulders, and the flare-back singed the hair on her left forearm before it went down. "You all right?" Elias said immediately from 2 feet away. "Fine." She was already moving to the next spot. "Keep digging." He kept digging. It took 40 minutes to kill it to a smolder along the brake line. By the time it was down to isolated patches of orange that Ruth could stamp out by foot, both of them were black with ash soaked through with sweat and breathing like they'd run a race. Elias leaned on the shovel handle and looked at the burned line. Then he looked at Ruth. "That was fast thinking," he said. "The wet sacks." "I keep them ready," she said. "This is the 3rd time this summer." He was quiet for a moment. 3 grass fires since June. Dry lightning. And one I'm not convinced was lightning. She looked north at the smoked-out grass. The Danner brothers were moving their cattle along this fence line the week before that one. Elias straightened up. His voice changed slightly. "You think someone said it?" "I think I don't have proof," Ruth said. "And I think men who want a water source and don't want to pay for it are capable of a lot of things that don't leave proof." She picked up the shovel. "Come back inside. Maisie will be awake and frightened." She was right on both counts. Maisie was standing at the back door when they came up from the field, her eyes wide and fixed on the smoke still rising north of the fence. When she saw Elias, her whole body went rigid for 1 second, the way it does when relief and leftover fear hit at the same time. She crossed the yard at a run and grabbed his arm with both hands. "I smelled it," she said high and tight. "I woke up and I smelled it, and you weren't here." "I'm here," Elias said. He put his hand over hers on his arm. "It's out. It's all right." "You should have woken me up." "There wasn't time, and you needed to sleep." He crouched down to her level. "Maisie, look at me. Everyone is fine." The girl looked at him, then past him at Ruth, who was black with ash and holding a shovel, and probably looked like she'd been through something considerably worse than she had. Maisie's eyes tracked over Ruth's singed forearm with the careful clinical attention of a child who had learned to assess damage quickly. "You got burned," Maisie said. "Barely," Ruth said. "Your arm is red." "It's fine." "You should put something on it." "I intend to." Ruth walked past both of them toward the pump. "I also intend to wash my face first, so if you want to help get the tin from the shelf beside the stove, The one with the green lid. That's the burn salve. Maisie disappeared inside at a run. Elias stood up. He looked at Ruth's arm, then at her face, and said nothing, but his jaw had gone tight in a way that communicated something he wasn't putting words to. Ruth ignored it because she did not currently have the capacity to manage someone else's guilt on top of everything else. "She's quick," Ruth said, nodding toward the door. "She's a lot of things," Elias said, and there was something complicated in his voice, not the uncomplicated pride a parent performs for an audience, but the real thing, layered with something that sounded like grief and worry and helplessness, all pressed together. Ruth understood that combination. She had felt it before, in a different kind of relation. She pumped water over her hands and said nothing. That evening sat differently than the morning had. The three of them ate supper at the kitchen table. Ruth's leftover bean stew stretched with water and a little salt pork, and the silence was the kind that has had something happen to it. Not empty silence. Silence with content. Maisie had applied the burn salve herself carefully, and without being asked a second time, her small tongue between her teeth the whole time, she worked her hands gentle, in a way that suggested she had done this kind of nursing before. She had not asked questions while she did it, which Ruth appreciated more than she would have admitted. Now Maisie was eating steadily, watching Ruth and her father, with the thoughtful expression of someone conducting a quiet experiment. "Where are your people from?" she asked Ruth. "Maisie," Elias said. "It's all right." Ruth glanced at the girl. "Kentucky originally. I came west with my husband in '74. "Do you have family back there?" "A sister. We don't write much." "Why?" "We disagree about things." Maisie appeared to find this answer deeply satisfying, as if it confirmed a theory. "Papa doesn't write to his brother either," she said. "They disagreed about the ranch when Grandpa died." "Maisie." This time Elias's voice had a bottom to it. "Am I wrong?" Maisie asked, with the particular weaponized innocence of a child who knows exactly what she is doing. The silence stretched. Then Ruth said evenly, "Families are complicated." "Ours is," Maisie agreed. "But it's smaller now, so there's less to argue about." She looked at her stew. "It's mostly just us." Elias set his spoon down. Something moved through his face that Ruth did not look at directly because it was the kind of thing that is private even when it happens in public. He reached out and put his hand briefly on top of Maisie's where it rested on the table. The girl turned her hand under his and held on for a moment. Then she let go and went back to her supper as if nothing had happened. Ruth looked at the wall and breathed evenly and told herself that this was nothing she needed to feel anything about. They were strangers eating at her table because of circumstance, not choice. By tomorrow, the horse would be fit to travel. They would leave. She would be alone again, which was exactly what she had chosen deliberately and with full understanding every morning for the past 4.5 years. "You're a good cook," Maisie said to no one in particular. "Better than Mrs. Crane." "Who's Mrs. Crane?" Ruth asked. "The woman Papa hired to cook at the ranch." Maisie's expression communicated precisely what she thought of Mrs. Crane. "She makes everything the same color." "That'll do, Maisie," Elias said, but he said it without heat, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way Ruth caught from the edge of her vision before she looked away. After Maisie was asleep on the bedroll in the barn again, which she had accepted with surprising equanimity, Ruth sat on the porch in the full dark, listening to the night insects and the occasional shift of a horse in the pen, and thinking through what she had agreed to today without entirely meaning to. She heard Elias come out and sit down on the other end of the step, keeping the distance. "You didn't plan to extend the stay," he said. "No," she agreed. "If you want us gone tomorrow morning, regardless of the horse, I understand." "If I wanted you gone, I would have said so." She looked out toward the north field where the burned grass still held a faint char smell. "The fire changes things. I'm not going to be caught in a second one alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said you think someone said it." "I think it's possible. If it's Danner or Caldwell's people, and they know I'm here now—" He stopped. "They already knew," Ruth said. "Holt saw you this morning, and men like Holt talk." "Then my being here puts you at more risk." "Or," Ruth said, "your being here means there's two of us instead of one, which in drought country, with an unreliable fence line, and a spring that half the county wants to steal, is not entirely a disadvantage." She turned her head to look at him. "Don't flatter yourself that you're only a problem, Mr. Turner. You're also 2 hands and a shovel and a man with a lawyer in Dunbar. That's not nothing." He held her gaze for a moment, and in the dark, his expression was quieter, more open than it had been all day, as if whatever front he maintained in daylight had less purchase without the light to harden it. "You don't give much away," he said. "No. But you said you get lonely sometimes." "Sometimes," she said, and her voice was level. "That doesn't mean I need company. It means I'm human." He nodded very slow. "My daughter likes you." "She likes testing people," Ruth said. "It's a different thing." "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes for her, it's the same thing." Ruth looked back out at the dark field. "She misses her mother," she said. "She carries it quietly, but it's there in everything she does. The way she watches, the way she makes herself useful, the way she asks questions about other people's families, like she's looking for a template." Elias said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "I know," he said. "And I don't know how to fix it. I keep thinking if I keep the ranch running well enough, if I keep everything in order." "That's not what she needs," Ruth said. "No." He let out a breath. "I know that too. Knowing a thing and doing something about it are 2 different problems." He paused. "You said you lost a son." She had not expected him to say that back to her. She had mentioned it that morning without thinking, the habit of explaining yourself briefly to strangers so they understand the shape of you without requiring the whole story. "I did," she said. "How old was he?" 9 days. The night made space for that. "I'm sorry," Elias said. "So am I," she said. "Every morning. And then I get up and I work, because that's the only answer that's ever made any sense to me." "Yes," he said. "That part I understand." They sat there in the dark for a while longer, not speaking. The heat still pressing down from the sky above, and the burned grass smell drifting south on the dead wind. And somewhere past the cottonwoods, something moved in the dark, a large deliberate sound. Something heavier than a coyote, something that made both of them go very still at exactly the same moment. Elias was on his feet. Ruth was already reaching for the rifle she kept beside the door. "How many cattle do you run?" he asked low and fast. 6 head. "Are they penned?" "South side. Should be." "Should be," he repeated, and the way he said it meant he had heard the same thing she had and drawn the same conclusion. "East pasture gate," she said. "If someone's pushing from the north—" "Go," he said. "I'll take the south." She went, and behind her the night that had been almost quiet came suddenly violently alive. Ruth heard the cattle before she saw what was driving them. She cleared the east pasture gate at a run, and the sound hit her immediately. 6 head of cattle moving in the dark, with the particular panicked energy of animals that have been deliberately spooked, not just startled. They were bunched at the far corner of the pen, pressing against the fence boards, and 2 of them had already found where the bottom rail had been knocked loose, and were working the gap wider with the blind, insistent pressure of frightened animals that only understand a way. She got to the gap before they pushed through it, planted herself, waved her arms, used her voice low and hard, the way you do with cattle, not shouting, commanding, and pushed them back from the break. Then she grabbed the loose rail with both hands and muscled it back into the bracket, her shoulders burning from the afternoon's firework, and held it there while she looked for something to wedge it. The sounds from the south side of the property were different. She heard Elias's voice, not the words, just the register, the flat, authoritative tone of a man who has spent his life giving orders to men who don't necessarily want to follow them. Then another voice, lower, arguing. Then a sound she knew, the particular sharp ring of a metal tool hitting the ground. She left the cattle and went south at a run. Elias had a man by the collar. He was not a large man, wiry young one of the riders from Holt's group that morning, the one who had stared at Ruth with the expression she hadn't had patience for. He was staring at nothing now, because Elias had him lifted half off the ground by the front of his shirt and was speaking to him in a voice so quiet and even that it was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "You're going to tell me who sent you," Elias said. "And then you're going to pick up that fence cutter you dropped and hand it to me. And then you're going to walk back the way you came and tell whoever sent you that this land is spoken for, and the next man they send will be speaking to the county sheriff." "I don't know what you're—" Elias tightened his grip. The young man's boots scraped the ground. "Try again." A silence. "Danner," the man said finally. "Bob Danner. Said the spring was fair game if no one was actively working it." "And you'd call 3 head of stolen cattle actively working the land," Ruth said. He looked at her. Had the sense not to answer. "Get off my property," she said. "Now." Elias let him down. The man grabbed nothing, said nothing, and went fast and badly, stumbling in the dark, and within 30 seconds, the sound of him was swallowed up by the flat beyond the fence line. Ruth picked up the fence cutter from the ground. She turned it in her hands. Good tool. New handle. Someone had bought this recently, not pulled it from a barn where it had been sitting since the previous decade. "That's the second Danner hand I've run off this fence in 2 weeks," she said. "They'll send more." Elias wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the dark where the man had gone, and his face had that contained, quietly furious expression. She was beginning to recognize the look of a man who had a very long fuse and a very serious result waiting at the end of it. "I know," Ruth said. "They're going to keep coming until the spring runs dry or you sell." "I know that too." She set the fence cutter on the fence post. "What I don't know is whether Holt is in it with them or just delivering messages for Caldwell." "Holt goes where the money is," Elias said. "He's been doing it for 20 years. He's Caldwell's man when Caldwell pays better, and Danner's man when Danner does." He turned to look at her. "Ruth, this is past what one person can hold alone." It was the first time he had used her given name without the circumstance forcing it. She noticed. She also noticed that she didn't correct him. "I've been holding it alone for 4 years," she said. "Against hard seasons and bank debt and loneliness, yes." His voice was not gentle exactly. It was straight. Not against organized pressure from 2 outfits working the same angle at the same time. That's different. That's not stubbornness that fixes it. That's numbers. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. "You're not wrong," she said, which cost her something, and they both knew it. He didn't make anything of it. That was the right choice. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take first watch." "You don't need to." "Ruth." He said it quietly. "Let me do this one thing without an argument." She looked at him. He looked back. And she did something she had not done in a very long time. She let someone else be right. 2 hours, she said. "Then you wake me." She went inside. She was asleep in under 10 minutes, which told her how tired she actually was. And she woke not to Elias's knock but to Maisie's voice, high, confused, frightened, coming from the direction of the barn. Ruth was off the bed and out the back door before the sound finished registering. But the barn was empty. The bedroll was rumpled, the barn door was hanging open, and Maisie Turner was not inside. Ruth stood in the empty barn for 2 full seconds, and then she did what she was trained by years of frontier living to do. She did not panic, she catalogued. The door was open, but not damaged. No sign of struggle. The small boots that Maisie had left by the bedroll were gone, which meant the girl had dressed herself, which meant she had left on her own, which in some ways was worse. She went to find Elias. He was at the north fence line doing exactly what he'd said he would, and the expression on his face when Ruth told him shifted through 5 different things in the span of 2 seconds before it settled into the controlled, whitened look of a parent operating on pure emergency instinct. "How long ago?" he said. "I don't know. I was asleep. You didn't hear her?" "I've been walking the perimeter." He was already moving. "She couldn't have gone far. She doesn't know the land." "That's what worries me," Ruth said. "There's an old root cellar on the east side of the spring. Boards are rotted in places. If she went looking for—" "Show me," he said. She showed him. They called her name as they went, not screaming it, not the full terrified call that would serve nothing but consistently every 30 seconds in the steady voice of people who need to be heard over distance. The night was dense, the moon behind cloud, and the ground was rough old creek channels, mesquite root systems, abandoned equipment left by the previous owner before Daniel bought the place. Elias caught his boot on something in the dark and went down hard on one knee and was back up before Ruth could react without a sound, without pausing. She saw it and said nothing. "Maisie." His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. Just slightly. He pulled it back. Silence. Then from below ground, muffled, small but real, "I'm here." The root cellar door was swollen with old moisture and summer heat, and it took both of them pulling together to drag it open. The smell that came up was earth and old wood, and something faintly sweet from the preserves Ruth had stored down there in spring. And at the bottom of the stone steps, sitting on the dirt floor, with her knees pulled to her chest and her back against the far wall, was Maisie Turner. She was not crying. Her eyes were dry and very bright, and she looked at both of them with the particular expression of a child who has decided to be angry instead of scared, because scared feels worse. "I heard you arguing," she said. Elias crouched at the top of the steps. "When?" "Before. When the man came. And before that too. In the yard." She looked at her father. "I heard what you said. About the numbers. About how it's too much for one person. Maisie." "You're going to make her leave," Maisie said. Her voice was flat and tight. "You're going to say it's not safe, and she has to come with us, or she has to sell, and then we'll go back to the ranch, and Mrs. Crane will make everything the same color again, and nothing will be different." The silence that came after that landed like a stone in still water. Ruth looked at Elias. He was looking at his daughter with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not authority, not guidance, not the contained, competent management he applied to most situations. Just the raw, exposed look of a man who had been understood more precisely than he was comfortable with. "Come up from there," he said. "No." "Maisie?" "No." She pressed her back harder against the wall. "Every time something gets good, you make it stop, because it's not practical, because it doesn't make sense, because you have to think about numbers." Her voice broke on the last word just briefly, and she pressed her mouth flat to stop it. "Mama didn't make sense either. She just stayed." The words hit Elias like something physical. Ruth watched it happen the way his whole posture changed, not collapsing, but shifting the way a large structure shifts when something foundational moves. "Come up," he said again softer. "Please." Maisie looked at Ruth. "Are you going to let him make you leave?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Nobody makes me do anything, Maisie. This is my land." "Then you'll stay." "I live here," Ruth said. "I'm not planning to stop." Something in the girl's face worked through a complicated set of calculations. Then she stood up from the dirt floor and climbed the steps. And when she reached the top, Elias pulled her into him without a word, one arm tight around her shoulders, and Maisie allowed it for exactly 5 seconds before she pulled back and said with extreme dignity, "I got dirt on my dress." "I see that," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. It'll wash. Yes, he said. It will. Ruth made coffee she didn't particularly need, and they all sat in the kitchen in the dead of the night, and the storm that had been threatening since early evening finally arrived. Not gently, but all at once. The way summer storms in that country do. With a crack of thunder so close it shook the window glass, and then rain coming down in a wall so thick you could barely see the barn from the porch. Maisie fell asleep at the table within 20 minutes of the rain starting her head on her folded arms, breathing the deep, boneless sleep of a child who has spent her emotional reserves completely and crashed. Ruth put a light shawl over her shoulders without waking her. Elias sat across from his sleeping daughter, with both hands around his cup, and the look of a man doing very serious work behind his eyes. She said her mother stayed, he said low enough not to wake Maisie. She did, Ruth said. Caroline was sick for 8 months before she died. She hid it for the first 4. Didn't want to. He stopped. She thought if she told me I'd try to fix it, which I would have, which is apparently the problem. He rubbed the side of his jaw. She was right to hide it. That's the part that keeps me up. Ruth watched the rain against the window. You're a man who fixes things, she said. That's not a flaw. It's only a flaw when fixing is all you know how to do. And when you can't fix something, then you sit with it, Ruth said. Which is what Maisie was doing in that root cellar. She couldn't fix your fear of losing things, and she couldn't fix the likelihood that you'd decide the practical answer was to move on. So she sat with it the only way she knew how. Elias stared at his cup. She's 8 years old. She's also spent 3 years watching a man she loves confuse motion with progress. Ruth said quietly, but without flinching. Children learn what they live with. He looked up at her. There was no defensiveness in his face. That was the thing about Elias Turner she had been slowly recognizing over the course of this day and a half. He could take a hard truth without deflecting it. He didn't always know what to do with it, but he could take it. You don't soften things, he said. I have found, Ruth said, that softening things is mostly something you do for your own comfort, not for the other person's benefit. He was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter sleep. My foreman Wade has been with me for 15 years, he said. He told me 3 months ago that Maisie needed a woman's influence in her life. I told him to mind the cattle. He told me I was raising a child the way I'd break a horse with consistency and distance, and neither of those things was going to be enough. He paused. He's not wrong either. You have very honest people around you for a man who doesn't particularly enjoy honesty, Ruth said. He laughed. It was sudden and brief and genuine, and it changed his face. Entirely. Took 10 years off. It put something warm in where the contained, careful management usually lived. It disappeared quickly, but she had seen it, and she found she couldn't entirely dismiss it once she had. Mrs. Holloway, he said, and his voice had shifted again, quieter, more deliberate, the tone of a man choosing each word with full awareness of its weight. I am going to say something, and I want you to hear it plainly, not as an offer or a negotiation or a business arrangement. She looked at him. I don't want to leave this place, he said. Not tomorrow. Not because the horse is still lame. Not because of Caldwell or Danner or the water rights lawyer in Dunbar. He held her gaze. Because I have not sat at a table that felt like that in 3 years. I have not watched my daughter fall asleep with color in her face and peace in her body in a very long time. And I have not talked to someone. He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. I have not talked to someone who talked back in a way that required me to actually think in longer than I can honestly remember. The storm put another sheet of rain against the window. Ruth did not look away from him. I'm not asking anything, he said. I want you to be clear on that. I'm not asking to stay. I'm not asking for more than you have already given. I'm simply being honest about the fact that leaving tomorrow will cost me something I didn't know I was still capable of losing. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the rain shifted from a wall to a steady pour, long enough that Maisie turned in her sleep and resettled. Long enough that the lamp between them burned down a degree and the shadows moved. Then she said, "My husband Daniel used to say that the most dangerous thing on the frontier wasn't drought or outlaws or bad winters. He said it was hope. Because hope is the thing you lose last, and when you lose it, there's nothing left that makes the work worth doing." Elias waited. "I stopped hoping for a long time," she said. It seemed like the safest way to manage. She looked at the sleeping girl. "I am finding it somewhat harder to maintain that position than I expected." He said nothing. But something in his face settled. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter. Something that looked like the feeling of being found after a long time of not being sure you were worth looking for. Then Maisie, without opening her eyes, said clearly, "I'm not asleep." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Elias said, "Maisie." "I just wanted you both to know," Maisie said, and then the even rhythmic breathing of actual sleep resumed so seamlessly that Ruth couldn't tell where the performance had ended and the real thing began. Bed. She woke up to silence which was wrong. The rain had stopped. The birds hadn't started yet. The particular quality of the dark. Outside the window said it was the last hour before dawn, and the silence said something had changed in it. Ruth was up and at the window before she'd finished waking. 3 horses, tied to her north fence post. No riders she could see, which was worse than riders she could see. She had the rifle off the wall, and Elias's shoulder in her hand, in under a minute, shaking him awake from where he'd fallen asleep in the chair. He came alert, fast, military fast. She noted the kind of waking that has been trained into a body. "North fence," she said. 3 horses, no riders visible. He was on his feet. "Maisie's in the barn." "Still there. I checked an hour ago." "Keep her there." "I'm not keeping anyone anywhere," Ruth said. "I'm going to my north fence on my land with my rifle. You can come or you can stay." He came. They went out into the post-storm stillness with the ground wet and soft underfoot, which meant the 3 horses were clearly visible in the fresh mud hoofprints coming in from the northwest, circling the fence line, stopping at the post. Recent. Very recent. Within the hour. But the riders were gone. Tied to the fence post where the horses were tied was a piece of paper. Ruth took it down. Elias held the lamp. It was not a legal document. It was not a letter. It was a survey map, an old one, hand-drawn, showing her property lines. And across the spring in thick red pencil, someone had drawn an X. And underneath it in handwriting she didn't recognize, "Last chance to sell fair. Next offer won't be." Ruth stood in the pre-dawn dark with the wet survey map in her hands and felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear. Fear had been her companion for so long, she had made a kind of peace with it. This was something different. This was the particular cold clarity that comes when a line gets crossed, when something that had been a slow accumulation of pressures becomes suddenly, unmistakably, a declaration. They were not asking anymore. She folded the paper carefully, put it in her apron pocket. "That's evidence," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "For the lawyer." "Yes." "Ruth." He waited until she looked at him. "This changes the timeline. I can't ride out tomorrow and leave you here with this. I won't." She looked at him for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn, the lamp between them, the wet ground around them full of the hoof prints of men who had come in the night to threaten what was hers. She thought about Daniel. She thought about Tommy. She thought about 4 years of waking alone and working alone and making every decision alone, and telling herself that this was strength and not just the fear of loss dressed up in practical clothing. She thought about a girl in a root cellar saying Mama didn't make sense either. She just stayed. "I know," she said finally. He waited. 2 more days, she said. "While I think about what comes next." Then we make a plan together. With the lawyer, with your foreman, with whatever it takes." She looked at him steadily. "But Turner, if you are in this, you are in it plainly. No hesitation. No practical second thoughts. No deciding the cost is too high when someone puts pressure on you." "Yes," he said without any pause at all. "I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "So do I." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and somewhere between the fence and the porch, the sky in the east began to go from black to the deep bruised blue that comes before color returns to the world. Behind her, she heard him follow. And ahead of her from the barn, she heard Maisie Turner's voice calling out clear as a bell in the new morning. Not frightened, not lost, just awake and present, and ready for whatever came next. "Mrs. Holloway, is there coffee?" Ruth almost smiled. "There will be," she called back, and she went inside to make it. The ride to the Double T took most of the following morning. Ruth had not packed much. She was not the kind of woman who packed much, had not been since the early years when she and Daniel had moved west with 2 trunks and learned within the first hard season that everything you carried was weight you had to move when moving was the only option left. She took her rifle, her ledger, the survey map with the red X on it, a change of clothes, and the tin of burn salve Maisie had applied to her forearm with such concentrated care 2 days ago. She left the homestead in the hands of a neighbor named Pete Garlow, 63 years old, and steady as fence post, who owed her a favor from the previous spring, when she had pulled his mule out of a sinkhole without being asked. Pete would water the livestock, check the spring level, and fire 2 shots in the air if anyone came through the fence line. It was not a perfect arrangement. It was the best available one, which was the only kind Ruth had ever known. Maisie rode between them on the recovered mare, who had come sound enough by the second morning to carry lightweight on flat ground. The girl had not stopped talking since they left the homestead, a continuous observational commentary on everything they passed, punctuated by questions that she did not always wait for answers to, and opinions she had formed with remarkable speed and confidence, for someone who had been unconscious from heat stroke approximately 48 hours prior. "That fence needs new posts," she said, nodding at a line they were passing. "That's the Garlow property," Ruth said. "Mr. Garlow should fix his fence. Mr. Garlow is doing his best. Papa's fences are better." "Maisie," Elias said. "They are," she said, untroubled. She looked at Ruth. "You'll see when we get there. Wade makes sure all the posts are set right. He says a bad fence is a promise you made to yourself that you didn't keep." Ruth glanced at Elias over the top of the girl's head. "Wade says a lot of things," Elias said. "Wade is usually right," Maisie said pleasantly. Elias said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in the way Ruth had learned meant he was choosing not to respond because the response available to him would prove the child's point. The Double T was not what Ruth had built in her mind during the ride, and her mind had built something considerable the way it always did when a man mentioned land and cattle and lawyers in the same breath. She had expected something that announced itself, something with the particular architectural arrogance of old money made visible. What she found instead was a working ranch, a serious one, the kind where everything was where it was because someone had thought hard about where it should be, not because someone had paid for the appearance of order. The main house was large, but plain built to last rather than to impress. The barn was 3 times the size of hers, and organized with a precision that would have satisfied a military quartermaster. The bunkhouse sat at the correct distance from everything else, which told her whoever had designed this layout understood that proximity to the main house was a social statement that working men did not always want made on their behalf. She noticed all of this without meaning to. The way you notice the structural details of a place when you have spent years being solely responsible for the structural details of your own. What she also noticed, standing at the entrance of the barn with his arms crossed, and the flat assessing expression of a man who had been informed of a plan he had not been consulted on, was Wade Mercer. He was exactly what Maisie had described. 50s weathered the kind of lean that comes from decades of physical work rather than any intent. He watched Ruth dismount with the calm, systematic patience of someone taking inventory, and when Elias introduced her, he shook her hand with the same pressure he would have given any man and said only, "Ma'am," in a tone that communicated precisely nothing. Maisie slid off the mare and grabbed Wade's hand and said, "She put out a grass fire and pointed a rifle at Papa, and she makes better biscuits than Mrs. Crane," and then ran toward the house before anyone could respond. Wade watched her go. Then he looked at Ruth. "The rifle part before or after the biscuits?" he said. "Before," Ruth said. He nodded once the way men nod when a piece of information confirms a calculation they had already run. "Come in then," he said, and turned back toward the barn, and that was apparently all the welcome available. Elias watched him go. "He likes you," he said. "How can you tell? He didn't ask you to wait outside." Nora Bell had been cooking at the Double T for 11 years, and she made her position clear within the first 10 minutes by handing Ruth a cup of coffee so strong it was practically a solid, and saying, "You can sit or you can help. I don't have a setting in between." Ruth put her bag down and picked up a knife. Nora watched her take the first vegetable without being told what to do with it, make the right cut, move to the next one, and said nothing. But something in her posture shifted a slight release, like a gate coming off the latch. They worked in silence for a few minutes. The kitchen was large and hot, and smelled of wood smoke and onions, and the underlying sweetness of dried apple from the barrel in the corner. Ruth had been in enough frontier kitchens to know that this one was run by someone who understood that a kitchen was not a room, it was a system, and every element of it was where it was for a reason. "He told me you're staying a few days," Nora said, without looking up from the pot. "That's right. He doesn't bring people here." "I understand that." "I'm not sure you do." Nora looked at her, then direct, not unkind, but with the measuring quality of someone who has watched over a household long enough to know what it costs when the wrong person walks into it. The last woman who came through that door left Maisie with the idea that people who seem like they're staying usually aren't. So if you're here for a week and then gone, "I'm here because men tried to take my spring, and Elias Turner has a lawyer in town," Ruth said. "That's the truth of it. What comes after that, I can't promise either of us." Nora studied her for a long moment. "That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have." Another silence, shorter this time. Then Nora said, "The apple barrel's in the corner. If you're going to be useful, start peeling." Ruth peeled apples. Dead. The trouble with the church social started before Ruth had fully decided to attend it. It had been Maisie's idea, delivered at breakfast on the third morning with the casual certainty of someone announcing a fact rather than making a request. "The Dunbar social is Saturday. We always go. Ruth should come." And then she had looked at her father with an expression that made arguing feel like choosing the wrong side of history. Elias had looked at Ruth. Ruth had said, "I didn't bring church clothes." Nora had said, without looking up from the stove, "I have a dress that'll fit you," which was how Ruth Holloway found herself standing in the social hall of the First Methodist Church of Dunbar, Texas, on a Saturday afternoon in July, wearing a blue cotton dress that fit well enough to be comfortable, and clearly enough to be noticed next to a man who owned half the county's best grazing land, and whose name every person in the room already knew. The first 20 minutes were manageable. People greeted Elias with the particular warmth reserved for wealthy men, who are also well-liked. The handshakes that lasted a beat longer than necessary, the women who spoke to him and smiled at Maisie and acknowledged Ruth with a polite, calculating glance that she recognized immediately. She had seen that glance before. It was the glance that was measuring what she was to him and running the answer against several variables simultaneously. She held her coffee cup and stood straight and did not apologize for being there. Then Clara Whitcomb arrived. Ruth knew who she was before anyone introduced them, because she walked into a room the way certain women do, not loudly, but in a way that required the room to reorganize slightly to accommodate her presence. She was 40, beautifully dressed for a church social, and she smiled at Elias with the warmth of an old and comfortable intimacy that was real enough to have history behind it. She looked at Ruth the way she might look at a piece of furniture that had been moved to an inconvenient location. "Elias," she said, taking his arm briefly, "we heard you'd had trouble on the road. Are you quite all right?" "Fine," he said. "Clara, this is Ruth Holloway. She owns the Holloway homestead south of the creek." "Oh," Clara said. And that single syllable did more work than most people accomplish with a paragraph. The Little Spring property. She smiled at Ruth, with her full face leaving nothing out. "I've heard of it, of course. Everyone's been so concerned about those small holdings in the drought. It must be terribly difficult managing alone." "I manage," Ruth said. "Of course you do." Clara's hand went briefly to her pearls, not nervous, just positioning. "Though I imagine it's a relief to have somewhere to go when things become overwhelming. Elias is so generous that way." The air in the immediate vicinity changed temperature. Ruth looked at Clara Whitcomb with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who had been in harder conversations than this one and come out the other side with her spine intact. "I came to Dunbar for a legal matter," she said. "Mr. Turner's lawyer is handling the documentation on my water rights claim. I'm a guest, not a charity case, but I appreciate your concern." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Not anger, not exactly. Recalibration. "Of course," she said again, and this time the words were thinner. Elias, who had been standing beside Ruth with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether and how to speak, said, "The water rights case is going well, actually. Frank Dunlap thinks the claim is airtight." Clara said, and turned the conversation toward something else with the practiced smoothness of someone who had been managing social situations since childhood. Ruth watched her go and said nothing, but she felt something in her chest that was neither fear nor anger. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of understanding exactly what kind of place she had walked into and exactly how much it was going to cost her to be here without pretending she was something other than what she was. Maisie appeared at Ruth's elbow. "I don't like Mrs. Whitcomb," she said with quiet, concentrated certainty. "That'll do, Maisie," Ruth said. "She looks at Papa like he's something she put down somewhere and is planning to pick back up." Maisie. But Ruth said it without heat because the description was precise enough to be almost admirable. The moment that mattered came 40 minutes later. Ruth was standing near the window with a second cup of coffee she didn't need when she heard Clara's voice from the group of women 2 steps away, pitched just carefully enough to be deniable, as deliberate, but just audibly enough to be clearly intentional. Of course, Elias has always been kind to people in difficult situations. It's one of his finest qualities. Though one does hope kindness isn't mistaken for something it isn't. A homesteader with a water dispute is hardly... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The 2 women she was speaking to received the meaning perfectly, and their responses, the slight smiles, the tilted heads, confirmed they had. Ruth set her coffee cup down on the windowsill. She had a choice. She knew it clearly in the way you know a fork in a road, not dramatically, but with complete certainty about what each direction costs. She could walk away. Preserve the dignity of having not been seen to react. Take the hit quietly and swallow it, which was what women in her position were generally expected to do. Or she could be exactly who she was. She turned. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said clearly enough that the surrounding conversation paused. "I caught the last part of that. I'd appreciate if you'd finish the thought out loud so we can all have the same conversation." Clara turned. The social smile stayed in place but tightened at the edges. "I'm sorry. You were saying a homesteader with a water dispute is hardly something," Ruth said. "I'd like to hear what the something is. Since you're talking about me and I'm standing close enough to hear it, I think we can dispense with the indirection." The room was listening now. Not obviously, people in small towns learn early how to listen without appearing to, but the background hum had shifted, and Ruth could feel the attention without seeing it. Clara's chin came up slightly. I simply meant that Elias has many demands on his generosity, and it's wise to be clear about what kind of connection. Mr. Turner is helping me secure legal documentation on a water rights claim that 3 separate outfits have been trying to pressure me out of, Ruth said. One of them hired a man to cut my fence at night. Another set fire to my north field. The third sent riders with a threat and a survey map with my spring marked for confiscation. She held Clara's gaze without blinking. I don't know what kind of connection you're trying to describe, Mrs. Whitcomb, but I know what kind I have. I'm a property owner with a legal claim and a lawyer, and I am not confused about my own situation, whatever you might be hoping. The silence was complete and absolute. Clara Whitcomb's face had gone through several stages and arrived at something that was not quite dignity and not quite retreat, but was the closest available combination of both. She said nothing. Ruth picked up her coffee cup from the windowsill and drank from it. And then Elias was beside her. She had not seen him cross the room. She did not know how much he had heard. But he was beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Clara, in the posture of protection, which would have been the wrong choice, and reduced her to something that needed shielding. Beside her, at exactly the same level, looking at Clara Whitcomb, with a calm and final expression. Clara, he said. Just the name, nothing else. It was enough. Clara excused herself to speak to someone across the room, and she did not come back. Hud. Ruth was quiet on the ride home. Maisie, for once, was also quiet, sitting between them with her hands folded and a thoughtful expression that suggested she was processing. Elias let the quiet run for about a mile. Then he said, "You didn't need me to step in." "No," Ruth said. "I know that." "Then why did you—" He was quiet for a moment. "Because she was wrong, and I didn't want her to be wrong in a room full of people who would remember it without being corrected." He looked at Ruth. "That's different from rescuing someone." Ruth thought about this. "Yes," she said. "It is." "I also," he said more slowly, "did not handle it as fast as I should have. I heard the beginning of it, and I was deciding whether to—" He stopped. "Whether it would cost you something to step in," Ruth said. "Yes." He said it plainly without softening it, which she gave him credit for. "And I decided that slowly. Too slowly." She looked at him. "You got there." "Later than I should have." "Yes," she said. "Later than you should have." She paused. "But you got there." He absorbed that without arguing with either part of it. Maisie said from between them, "I think Mrs. Holloway was very brave." "She was," Elias agreed. "I think you were slow," Maisie said to her father, with the serene honesty of a child who had not yet learned to package truths attractively. "I know," Elias said, "but you did the right thing eventually." "I'm aware, Maisie. I'm just saying there's room for improvement." Ruth felt something move through her chest that was not quite a laugh and not quite relief, but had the same warmth as both. She kept her face straight. Elias caught her eye over the girl's head, and the expression on his face was the combination of exasperation and helpless affection that Ruth had come to recognize as his most honest one. Wade Mercer was waiting for them at the gate, not in the way a man waits when he has good news. In the way a man waits when he has been turning something over for an hour and has decided it has to be said regardless of the reception. He fell in beside Elias as they dismounted, spoke low enough that Maisie, already running toward the house, wouldn't catch it. "Got a wire from Frank Dunlap. The water rights filing went in this morning. Official record. But Caldwell's lawyers filed a counterclaim this afternoon. Faster than Frank expected." Elias went still. "How fast does Frank need an answer?" "He wants both of you in his office Monday morning. Says if Turner backs the claim publicly before the counter gets a hearing, it changes the weight of it considerably." Wade paused. "Publicly," he said, "not privately, on paper and in front of whoever's there to see it." Ruth had heard all of it. She looked at Elias. He turned to her. And for the first time since she had met him, the contained, measured quality he carried was entirely absent. He was not managing the situation, he was standing in it. "I told you in your yard," he said. "No hesitation, no practical second thoughts." "You told me that," Ruth agreed. "Before you knew it would be public and official, and opposed by a company with enough lawyers to fill a courthouse." "Yes," he said. "And I meant it then. I mean it now." He held her gaze. "Do you believe me?" She looked at him for a long time. The late afternoon light had turned everything gold and harsh the way it does in that country in the last hour before dark comes down, and he was standing in it without flinching and without looking away, and the thing Ruth Holloway had been protecting herself from for 4.5 years was standing in front of her asking a direct question. She thought about her spring. She thought about the red X on the survey map. She thought about Maisie in the root cellar saying she just stayed. She thought about what it had cost her to be soft once, and what it had cost her to stop being soft, and whether the cost of either one was actually the thing she had thought she was paying. "Monday morning," she said. "Frank Dunlap's office." Elias let out a breath that had been held a long time. Wade looked at both of them, and then at the ground, and then he said very quietly, "About time," and walked back toward the barn before either of them could respond. Ruth watched him go. "I thought he didn't approve of emotional mess." "He doesn't," Elias said. "He approves of things getting resolved." A pause. "There's a difference." Inside the house, Maisie was calling for Nora, asking about supper, asking if there were biscuits, asking something else Ruth couldn't quite hear from where she stood, but that had the particular bright, relentless, alive quality of a child who had stopped waiting for something to go wrong. Ruth looked at Elias. "I need to write to Pete Garlow tonight," she said. "Tell him to stay on the property through Monday." "I'll have one of my hands right out first thing tomorrow," Elias said. "Nobody touches that fence line while this is in front of a lawyer." "Good." She turned toward the house, then stopped. "Turner." "Yes." "Don't be slow on Monday," she said. "Whatever Frank Dunlap asks you to stand up and say, don't be slow on it." He looked at her steadily. "I won't." She believed him. She went inside and the smell of Nora's cooking hit her at the door, and Maisie's voice found her from somewhere deeper in the house, and for the first time in 4.5 years, Ruth Holloway walked into a home that was not hers and did not feel like a stranger in it. That frightened her more than the riders in the night had. And she walked forward anyway. Frank Dunlap's office smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the particular kind of anxiety that accumulates in rooms where people come to fight over things they cannot afford to lose. Ruth knew the smell. She had been in rooms like this before the bank in '79, when the note on the homestead came due 6 weeks after Daniel died, and she had sat across from a man in a clean suit who looked at her the way people look at problems they are in the process of solving. She had not flinched then. She did not flinch now. Elias sat beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. Frank Dunlap was a small man with sharp eyes and the efficient, no-ceremony manner of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had stopped finding ceremony useful. He spread the documents across the desk and walked them through the situation the way a doctor walks a patient through a diagnosis, clearly, completely, and without the kind of softening that wastes everyone's time. Caldwell's counterclaim argued that Ruth's water rights documentation was incomplete, that the original land grant had a provision allowing shared water access in drought conditions, and that Ruth's refusal to honor that provision constituted a breach of Frontier Compact law. That provision, Frank said, tapping the relevant page, applies to naturally occurring water sources on shared boundary land. Mrs. Holloway's spring is entirely within her recorded property line. It doesn't apply. But Caldwell's lawyers know that. They're not filing this because they think they'll win it. They're filing it to make it expensive and slow and uncomfortable enough that you sell before the hearing. "I'm not selling," Ruth said. "I know that," Frank said. "The question is how we make that clear in a way that ends this rather than extending it." He looked at Elias. Which is where you come in, Mr. Turner. Elias leaned forward. Tell me what you need. A public statement of support for Mrs. Holloway's claim. Signed. Your name on record beside hers as a corroborating witness to the intimidation attempts, the fence cutting the fire, the survey map. You're the largest independent operator in this county. When you put your name on something, other men read it and decide which way they're standing. The room was quiet. Ruth watched Elias's face. She had told him not to be slow. She was watching to see if he remembered. He reached across the desk and picked up the pen. Show me where, he said. Frank showed him. Elias signed. He did not pause, did not reread, did not look at Ruth for confirmation. He signed the way a man signed something he decided before he walked in the door. Ruth looked at the signature on the page, clean, unhesitating, permanent, and felt something in her chest that she did not name because naming it in a lawyer's office in front of Frank Dunlap seemed like the wrong place for it. She picked up the pen and signed beside him. Frank took both documents, straightened them, and said, There'll be a county commissioners meeting Thursday. Water access disputes of this size go before the full commission. Caldwell will have representation. So will you. He looked at Ruth. They're going to try to make this about your capacity to manage the claim alone. Your resources. My gender, Ruth said. Frank met her eyes. Yes. I've been managing that particular argument for 4 years, she said. It hasn't improved with time, but I've gotten faster at answering it. Frank almost smiled. Good, he said. Because Thursday, Mrs. Holloway, you're going to need to answer it in front of 12 men who are all trying to decide whose side costs them less. Wade Mercer was waiting outside the office with 3 horses and an expression that confirmed he had expected this meeting to result in exactly what it had. He handed Elias the reins of his horse without comment, then handed Ruth hers, and then said, Maisie's at the dry goods with Nora. She's been in there 40 minutes, which means either Nora's buying more than she planned, or Maisie's talking someone's ear off. Both, Elias said. Both, Wade agreed. He looked at Ruth. How'd it go? Thursday, she said. County commission. Wade absorbed this. You're speaking. Yes. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed a conclusion he had reached independently. Good, he said. You should be the one talking, not a lawyer. Not... He paused, glanced at Elias. Not someone speaking for you. You. That was always the plan, Ruth said. I know, Wade said. I just wanted to make sure it stayed that way. He pulled himself up into the saddle. For what it's worth, ma'am, I've watched men try to take things from people smaller than them for 50 years in this country. The ones who fight their own fight in their own words, those are the ones who keep what's theirs. He tipped his hat exactly once and rode toward the dry goods without waiting for a response. Ruth stared after him. I told you he liked you, Elias said. He has a strange way of showing it. That, Elias said, is the warmest he's been with anyone since 1887. Thursday came with the particular aggressive clarity of a summer morning that intends to be remembered. The county commissioners' hall in Dunbar held 40 people when it was full. It was full. Ruth had not expected the farmers from the South Quarter, the 2 widows from the Creek Road, the elderly rancher named Beaumont, who ran the smallest spread in the county and had been fighting boundary disputes since before Ruth arrived in Texas. She had not expected Pete Garlow, who had ridden 40 miles from her homestead on an old horse that needed the rest more than the journey, and who sat in the 3rd row with his hat on his knee and gave her a single nod when she came in. She had not expected Nora Bell, who was sitting in the 2nd row with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had arranged to be here and dared anyone to find it remarkable. She also had not expected Maisie, who was supposed to be at the ranch with one of the hands, and who was instead sitting beside Nora with her hands folded and her back straight and her chin at an angle that communicated that she knew she was not supposed to be here and had decided that was a separate issue. Ruth looked at her. Maisie looked back without flinching. Ruth turned to face the front of the room. Caldwell's lawyers were already seated at the table on the left, two of them well-dressed, carrying the particular ease of men who are accustomed to courtrooms and commissioners and the arithmetic of winning. Between them sat Robert Caldwell himself, 60 years old, heavy through the jaw, watching Ruth come in with the calm, patient attention of a man who has bought outcomes before and expects to buy this one. Commissioner Hayes called the room to order, and the thing began. Caldwell's first lawyer spoke for 12 minutes. He was smooth, organized, and very good. He talked about frontier compact law and shared resources and community obligation and the responsibility of individual property holders not to hold essential water access hostage to personal interest. He made Ruth sound like a woman hoarding rain. She sat very still and listened to every word. When he finished, Hayes looked at her. "Mrs. Holloway, you have the floor." Ruth stood. She did not use the notes Frank Dunlap had prepared because she had read them the previous night, and they were very good and entirely in the language of lawyers, which was not her language and never had been. She put them face down on the table. She looked at the 12 commissioners and then at the room behind them. "My husband, Daniel Holloway, filed the original land claim on our property in 1874, she said. He built the main structure, sank the primary well, and identified the spring in the northeast quarter of our acreage as a natural water source occurring entirely within our property boundary. He recorded that boundary with the county in 1875 with 2 independent witnesses. Daniel died in April of 1882. I have held that property, that boundary, and that spring through 4 years of drought. 2 bad cattle seasons. 3 attempts to purchase my land. Below assessed value. 2 incidents of deliberate fence damage. 1 grass fire. I cannot prove was set deliberately, but have significant reason to suspect, and a midnight visit in which riders left a survey map on my fence post with my spring marked for confiscation and a note telling me this was my last chance to sell fair." She paused. The room was completely silent. "The argument you have heard today about shared water access and frontier compact law is a legal argument," she said. "It is not an accurate one. My spring is on my land. That is not a dispute. That is a surveyed fact on a recorded document. What is actually being argued here today is whether a woman alone on 40 acres can hold what is legally hers against a company with enough money to make holding it expensive." She looked at Robert Caldwell directly. "I am not a difficult woman. I am not an unreasonable one. I have never refused water to a man whose child was dying of thirst, and I have been asked, and I have given it, and I would give it again." She did not look at Elias, though she felt him go very still in the chair behind her. "What I will not give is my legal right to my own property, because someone else has decided my survival is less important than their convenience." Commissioner Hayes shifted in his chair. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm not finished," she said quietly and clearly. He stopped. "The men who came to my fence line at night were not thirsty," she said. "They were not desperate. They were employed by people with resources I do not have acting on the calculation that I would exhaust before they would. That is not a water dispute. That is a campaign." She put both hands flat on the table. "I am asking this commission to confirm what the law already says, that my property line is my property line, and that a recorded water source within it is mine to manage as I see fit, with or without the approval of men who want it for themselves." She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then from the second row, Nora Bell said clearly and without apology, "She's right." And from beside her, Maisie Turner said with the flat, devastating certainty of a child who does not yet know she is supposed to be quieter than this, "Obviously." A sound moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, but the release of something that had been held tight, and 2 of the 12 commissioners had their mouths pressed flat in ways that meant different things. Caldwell's second lawyer rose to respond, and spent 7 minutes attempting to reframe what Ruth had said as emotional, rather than legal, which was a mistake, because 3 of the commissioners were farmers who had lost water access before and recognized the framework being used against her, and did not appreciate having their intelligence managed. Commissioner Hayes called a recess. During the recess, Robert Caldwell crossed the room. Ruth saw him coming and did not move. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a calculation he thought he had already completed. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "My company needs water access in this county. I am prepared to offer you a fair lease arrangement above market legal documented for access to your spring for the duration of this drought. That offer is on the table right now, before the commission comes back." Ruth looked at him, and the intimidation stops. "It was never sanctioned by me personally. Mr. Caldwell?" Her voice was even. "I have a survey map with a red X on my spring and a threat written underneath it. I have a burned fence line and a cut gate. I have a man who told me who sent him before he ran off my property in the dark. So let's not discuss what was and wasn't sanctioned, and let's discuss what you're actually offering." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Access lease. Fair market plus 20%. My lawyers draft it, your lawyer reviews it. Full stop on any pressure from any outfit associated with my company. And written acknowledgement," Ruth said, "that the counterclaim is withdrawn." A pause. "Yes." "And a letter to Bob Danner telling him the spring is off his list." "I don't control Danner." "You control enough," she said. "That's the offer, Mr. Caldwell. All of it or none of it. I'm not negotiating pieces." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. The commission came back. Caldwell's lawyers announced the withdrawal of the counterclaim. The documentation had been drafted and signed in 20 minutes flat by people who were very motivated to have the thing done. Frank Dunlap received his copy. The commissioners recorded it. Hayes read the final determination into the official record. Ruth Holloway's water rights claim confirmed property boundary, confirmed no basis for contested access found. It took 4 minutes. 40 years of frontier law and 4 minutes to say what should have been said the first time. Ruth sat in her chair and did not cry, because she had not cried at Daniel's funeral, and she had not cried when Tommy died, and she was not going to cry in a county commissioner's hall over a water rights ruling. But she pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed through it until the feeling passed into something she could manage. Pete Garlow shook her hand on the way out and said, "Danny would have been proud."